this is Ryan Clancy, Chief Strategist for No Labels, here for another edition of No Labels Talks with my colleague, Holly Page. Holly, how you doing?
I'm great, Ryan. How are you?
I'm doing okay. We are all headed into Memorial Day weekend this weekend, which is, look, it's something we always think about as it's time to be with family. It's time to relax and go to barbecues and all that's true. But of course, what it's really about is we live in this country in safety and security because there were generations of people who came before us who put everything on the line to make that possible.
Absolutely. And it is as if, especially when people get to hear the conversation you just had with Seth Cropsey, it is as if we are again at a moment in history where we have to make some sacrifices and commit ourselves to what the future of the world and America's role in it will be. And it, as I was listening to the conversation that you were having, it did make me sad, to be honest, that we are going to face a November presidential election of President Biden versus President Trump and maybe RFK somewhere in it, but that it isn't injecting the new vision and ideas and understanding of the world as it is and as it's becoming.
Well, this is really the focus of the conversation today. We're talking to Seth Cropsey, who's just a great national security thinker. And he talks about how he thinks we really are in the 1930s, in the sense that just as then you had Japan and Italy and Germany creating this axis looking to carve up the world. He sees the same thing now with Russia, Iran, and China. But the difference, and this gets to your point, is he doesn't see either of the major presidential candidates really grabbing the bully pulpit and explaining to Americans the moment we're in and what it means.
A couple things come to mind with that. Number one, I think this is a direct result of the political establishment thinking about voters and citizens as customers. We're not customers, and I think not wanting to give a sober accounting of what's really happening in the world is a direct result of that. And we all could pay a very dear price for it.
Holly, you're totally right. And look, we're guilty of that. I can't imagine or remember how many times I talked about some policy and I defended it by saying, well, this is what the polls say. This is what the public wants. Mm-hmm. Look, I feel pretty certain in saying the public doesn't want to hear that after decades of peace and stability, we are entering this very scary moment that is akin to the 1930s, where these adversaries are on the march and trying to, in a lot of ways, break apart the entire infrastructure that veterans built. If you think about what's happening, you think about World War II and all the people that sacrificed for that. What came after that was an American-led world order. And that is really sustained for 80, 90 years. And that is what Russia, Iran, and China are all trying to pick apart.
Exactly. And the other thing that really has become clear and was highlighted in your conversation with Seth is our adversaries have one tactic that they are applying to every situation, which is division. They're trying to divide America from Israel. They're trying to divide Americans from each other. And unfortunately, there are too many politicians even who are happily assisting in that strategy. And I think it just highlighted for me why No Labels work is so important, why our call for committing to solving problems and recognizing that people don't necessarily have to come at it from the same point of view is so critical.
It is. Well, look, let's get right to it. This week's edition of No Labels Talks with Seth Cropsey. Seth is a former naval officer, senior defense official in the Reagan, Bush 41 and 43 administrations. He leads a think tank called the Yorktown Institute, and he writes regularly for the Wall Street Journal, and that's actually why we invited him on this week. He talks about in his column how he thinks America is unfortunately stumbling into war by some decisions we are and are not making on the world stage. So with that, let's hand it over to Seth Cropsey, No Labels Talks.
And happy Memorial Day.
Happy Memorial Day.
He's Republican. There's a fight in the race. Who's gonna win? Put your differences aside, man, if you can. 'Cause there's way too many people suffering.
Hey, this is Ryan Clancy, Chief Strategist for No Labels, here with another edition of No Labels Talks. And this week, joining me is Seth Cropsey. Seth is a former naval officer, a senior official in the Reagan, Bush, 41 and 43 administrations, and current president of the Yorktown Institute, a national security think tank. Seth, thanks for joining us.
Ryan, it's my pleasure. Thank you for asking.
Sure. So Seth writes a regular commentary in the Wall Street Journal, and this week he wrote something very provocative. He said that Iran has set a trap to divide Israel and the US, and that the US has walked right into it. Can you explain what you mean by that, Seth?
Well, the jaws of the trap are is Hamas, and the length of time that it's taken to defeat Hamas has produced a public reaction that was anticipatable, certainly in Europe and probably here in the United States. And given the Biden administration's temporizing in Ukraine, the administration's reaction to a drawn-out conflict could easily have been predicted, and in fact was. So that's the trap that Iran successfully set.
Seth, I mean, do you have a sense for whether October 7th the Iranians were behind that? Do you have any evidence to suggest that?
Well, if you pay your son's gasoline bills and he goes out and wrecks the car, what responsibility do you bear?
Right.
It's not quite a good analogy because you did not expect your son to wreck the car, but Iran did expect Hamas to do what they did.
Right.
So at the mildest way of putting it is that that the Iranians were behind the Hamas attacks, that they are behind the Houthi continued piracy, another issue where the United States is not taking the action consistent with our foreign policy and military policy, and the same could be said about Hezbollah.
Well, so Seth, you get at something, as a lot of our listeners know. I mean, Iran funds a lot of bad actors in the region, be it Hamas in Gaza, be it the Houthis in Yemen, Hezbollah in Lebanon. But of course, the question is, where do they get the funding for this? And a big issue underpinning this is the nuclear deal signed under President Obama in 2016. So just to remind everybody, that deal involved the United States lifting certain economic sanctions on Iran in exchange for Iran agreeing to limit their nuclear program. President Trump then came in.
Well, to limit their nuclear program for a limited amount of time.
Right, a decade, correct?
Right.
Yeah. President Trump comes in, takes the US out of the deal, reimposes many of the sanctions. Then President Biden comes in, tries to start getting back into the deal. He once again lifts the sanctions. How are we supposed to understand this nuclear deal and the impact it's had over the region over the course of the last 8 years?
Oh, I don't think an advanced understanding is necessary. It was a bad idea in the first place. Telling a group of rulers such as the Iranians that they couldn't develop nuclear weapons for 10 years was a foolish idea, because even if they observed it, when the 10-year limit was up, they go right back to it. They didn't observe it, and they're back at it right now. So it was not strategic thinking at advanced levels. That's a polite way of putting it.
Is there good data to suggest that the money that flowed into Iran from the lifting of the sanctions, particularly on their oil sector, that has enabled Iran to be more adventurous in funding mischief throughout the region?
I think it's a matter of reason. With a cash-strapped regime that's sanctioned, any funding that they can get will go into their long-term foreign policy ambitions. And if you have any doubt about that, or if any doubt about that remains, look at the protests in Iran as they've come and gone, and the signs of the expressions of the protesters that they don't like the idea of Iranian money being used to fund terrorism, which they don't support.
Well, what is the Iranian strategy? I mean, what is it? What are they trying to achieve on the foreign policy front?
Two things. One is the destruction of the Israeli state, and the second is the elimination of the United States from the Middle East.
And how do you
Get us out and destroy Israel.
So do you think the Biden administration believes that is their strategy, or are they operating off a different set of assumptions?
I think they're operating off the assumption that that Obama produced, because in large measure, many of the Obama people are staffing the Trump administration. And that assumption is that Iran could somehow become a stabilizing force for positive results in the Middle East. If it sounds crazy, I think it is.
So I want to get Seth into, we have a month from now, we're going to have a presidential debate. Almost inevitably, this issue is going to come up, and we're going to get a sense for the contrasting visions of Biden and Trump, specifically as it relates to Iran. But look, you're pretty, you don't pull any punches when you describe what you view as the Biden administration's strategic posture. You write this week. You say the Biden administration's non-strategy for dealing with the emerging axis of Iran, China, and Russia is to avoid conflict at all costs and restrain American allies. Do you think conflict aversion is the organizing strategic principle for the administration, or is there some other strategy that they're pursuing that maybe they're just not clearly communicating?
Well, the reason that you may be right. There may be another strategy that is, underneath what we see. But what we see is that the United States is not taking the prospect of cross-strait conflict in the Taiwan Strait seriously, and that is indicated by the non-delivery of long-promised weapons. The failure to coordinate the militaries of the United States and Taiwan more closely, that is, for example, by more officer and military to military exchanges, some sort of command and control operation, so that if there were a conflict in the Taiwan Straits, the United States and Taiwan would be able to communicate with each other and with the Japanese. None of those things are happening. And if you go west and you look at Ukraine, it's a similar picture, where the objective is to freeze the conflict and to keep the Russians from further depredations against Ukrainian territory, but it's not to remove them, and it's certainly not to defeat them. And then there's been a half a year hiatus between the last military assistance to Ukraine and when we finally got our act together. And that is not entirely the Biden administration's fault. Congress bears some responsibility for that. And then again, you see the same pattern repeated in Gaza, where the administration has been forestalling Israel, the IDF's campaign to destroy Hamas entirely for several months now. So there may be another reason involved here, but there's constant reference by Biden and by Jake Sullivan, by Blinken, the Secretary of State, to avoiding escalation. That is to say, keep things as they are.
Let me ask you about that, because so the counter from somebody in the administration might go a little bit like this. They might say, look, we don't want to escalate things too far in Ukraine, like, for example, telling the Ukrainians they can use American weapons to launch into Russia, because we're worried the Russians will escalate and maybe Putin will follow through on his nuclear threats. We don't want Iran to push or Israel to push too hard because we're worried that that's going to set off a broader war and Hezbollah is going to get involved. So what would your counter be to that?
Well, Chamberlain didn't want to offend Hitler. How'd that work out?
Yeah.
I mean, look, with each increase in the capability of military weapons asked for by Ukraine and initially objected to by this administration, subsequently, those weapons have been delivered. And the reason for not delivering them initially, namely fear of escalation to nuclear or whatever levels, has turned out to have no basis. Where are we learning from that?
Right. So Seth, here's a question. Thinking about former President Trump and the people around him, how would you characterize their strategic posture towards this axis that you described, Iran, Russia, and China? What are the fundamental ways in which that differs from the Biden administration approach?
I wish I could answer your question.
Okay, why can't you?
I don't know. I mean, you can point to individual, to particular acts that the Trump administration took, like the assassination of Soleimani, right, as a sign of the Trump administration's understanding of the Iranian threat. But and you could certainly, it would be well within reason to note that the Trump administration's Abraham Accords and the attempt to try to move things ahead as far as resolving some of the issues in the Middle East. But where Trump stands now on Israel's efforts to defend itself, I don't know. He may have said, but I haven't seen it. You'd have, as far as I can tell, you simply have to speculate what Trump means when he says that if he became president, that the Ukraine war would be over in a day. I don't know what that means. It could mean that he would give the Ukrainians what they need to defeat Russia, or that he would simply walk away from it. So I can't tell you.
Seth, I want to ask you about, you know, the parallels between today and the 1930s and how that should influence the thinking of Trump and Biden as they head into 2025, whomever the next president is going to be. So you've described this axis of Russia, Iran, China. Of course, in the 30s, it was Germany, Japan, and I'm having Italy, having a Rick Perry moment here. But do you think that's where we are? That is the threat posed by Russia, Iran, and China analogous to the one the United States faced in the 1930s?
Yes.
Why?
Because the you see the same because the ambitions of the Axis powers then were similar, fundamentally similar to the Axis powers now, except with one exception, that the British were more the target, the initial target, um, in the European theater. In the Pacific theater, the United States was the target. So the targets were somewhat diffuse. Today they're not. The including the North Koreans, the Russians, the Iranians, the Chinese, the object is one, and that is the United States.
Okay. So Seth, that begs a question, which is, if you accept that assumption that the defining challenge in the world today is this emerging axis that wakes up every day thinking about how do we undermine American power? What is it that the United States, particularly what is it that our next president should be doing that we are not doing right now to deal with this?
Taking a good look at the Reagan defense budget and copying it. Telling the American people what the threat that Russia, China, and Iran, and to a certain extent North Korea pose. Preparing the American people for the possibility that that this could lead to conflict. Articulating what's at stake, not once or twice, but again and again and again, and imposing effective sanctions on the economies of these countries, all of which are problematic, that will at least attempt to have an effect.
I said, I want to be a little more specific. When you say being clear to the American people about the threats these countries pose and what's at stake. And so a lot of sense here, we're talking about the presidential bully pulpit, you know, what they would communicate to Americans about what this moment means. What is the threat they pose? What is at stake? If you were advising President Biden and President Trump and on delivering a speech in which they level set with the American people about the threat that is posed and what's at stake, what is that?
Well, the threat that's posed is the domination of the Eurasian landmass from the English Channel to the Taiwan Strait by hostile powers. In a word, acting somewhat in accord with each other, and perhaps even simultaneously. So the risk in Europe itself is that a Ukrainian defeat would encourage Russia to test NATO. And that test is most likely in the Baltic states, although it's possible in the Black Sea states as well. And that would cause a challenge to NATO, which right now militarily, the Russians would be at a disadvantage, but politically and diplomatically, uh, it would be very difficult for the West, for NATO. In the Middle East, as I mentioned ago, the challenge that Iran poses is uh, control over the oil exports of the region, which affects our allies in Europe. Um, the removal of the United States as a stabilizing external force in the Middle East, uh, the the destruction of the Israeli state, the only democracy, true democracy in the Middle East, and in China or the Taiwan Strait, the loss of Taiwan to Chinese invasion would have extraordinary impact on the semiconductors that we depend on from Taiwan. And it would put China in a geographic position to extend their power, to project power beyond the first island chain, at which Taiwan is the center. It would give China the same ability to move north or south in a maritime theater that the Japanese possessed when they ruled Taiwan. All of those things militate against our security, our economy, and our position as the global power.
Seth, you know there are forces on the left and right who, for different reasons, will hear this and say, America is way too fixated on everybody else's problems to the expense of our own. It's not nice that these countries are going to do this, but this is really not something that should be the United States business in engaging in. I guess my question to you is, if the United States were to retrench, if we were to disengage more from the Middle East, disengage more from Asia, do you think if left to their own devices, the Chinese would just go ahead and try to take Taiwan? Do you think Russia would seek to move beyond Ukraine and move further into Europe?
I think so because they've said so. Russia, Putin's statement about the end of the Soviet Union being the greatest geopolitical disaster of the 20th century needs to be understood for what it is. We, that is Russia, the Soviet Union, lost an empire and we want it back. And that empire ranged from the western border of Russia to the center of Germany. And I think that anybody who thinks that if Putin were able to achieve that kind of victory, that he'd stop there, is just not reading him correctly. I don't know how many times Xi Jinping has said that the object of his, a critical object of his rule is to reunify, that's the term he uses, conquer would be more accurate, Taiwan. You either take these people seriously at their word, or else you say, well, they may be kidding. I'm going to roll the dice.
When you look at
I am not in favor of rolling the dice.
Yeah. When you look, Seth, at the situation in Washington today, notwithstanding the fact that you do have these isolationist voices on both sides, do you think there is enough of a bipartisan consensus of leaders that see the world as you do, which is to say the defining challenge is this axis, and every step the United States takes on the foreign policy front should be with that reality in mind?
Ryan, I think that it exists in various forms, and that national leadership, presidential leadership, is required today the way it was in 1941, 1940, explain what the stakes are and to uh, encourage representatives and the country as a whole to understand the deteriorating international security situation that we find ourselves in. And if we don't do that, then we're going to have another Pearl Harbor kind of incident. And we are woefully unready.
You think that in the absence of the United States being prepared, there will be an attack somewhere on either on the American homeland or a major American military base or somewhere in the world?
Well, somewhere in the world, I would go yet somewhere in the world. I think the chances of a significant attack by a state against the United States, even in its currently unprepared form, are low. But I think the chance of an attack against Taiwan, a a further Russian move into Europe, um, uh, more Iranian mischief in the Middle East are all very likely, and will be encouraged to the extent that those countries see that the United States is simply unwilling uh, to act.
Seth, I want to close with two final questions. You just mentioned Iran, and of course, the big news in Iran, of course, the last week, their president died in a helicopter crash. They're going to have, or they're supposed to have an election here within less than 2 months. The commentary since then is that not a lot will probably change, but this is a moment of vulnerability for the Iranian regime, which is not very popular among the Iranians back home. If you were advising the Biden administration, what would you tell them to do about how they should change their posture over the next couple months? Should they not look to influence the course of events in this political transition in any way? Should they? Should they work somehow to empower other actors in Iran? What would you tell them to do?
Speak to the Iranian people, who will have some say in this kind of election.
What would you say to them?
That if they if they favor a moderate regime, they should go out in the streets and demonstrate for it. And I'd also say that the Biden administration would benefit itself and the United States and the West in general by increasing our public diplomacy outreach to Iran, which currently consists of, for all intents and purposes, a couple of hours of television broadcasting a day and a budget of $17 million a year, which is woefully inadequate to reaching people who are not friendly to the clerical regime, not friendly to the radical elements in the IRGC, and have shown repeatedly over the years their willingness and their courage to go out into the streets and demonstrate that.
Okay. Seth, I want to close with a final question, which is that every week we invite our community to send in a question to the person we're going to be speaking to this week. And of course, you've spent your whole career studying great power conflict and war. And one of the questions we got from Zach Ginder from Kentucky was, how do you think artificial intelligence is going to impact the shape of global conflict here in the years and decades to come?
Less than other people do. Artificial intelligence, like every instrument that has military application, can be met on the other side by the adversary with its own artificial intelligence. So the two do not cancel each other out, but they certainly tend toward balancing. And that makes ought to reconcentrate our thinking and our action on the balance of forces. the things that are manipulated by artificial intelligence. And on that score, we are in trouble.
You've said, Seth, to just follow up on that, that some other elements, like, for example, sea power, would really be the defining factor in deciding which countries shape the 21st century. Is that another area where you think, when you talk about, you suggest the next president embrace the Reagan defense budget, would a big chunk of that go towards building out our naval capabilities?
And maritime capabilities, yes. And the difference is naval, it means vessels with weapons, and maritime means the merchant marine, merchant ships. If you don't have the latter, it's extremely difficult to operate the former. Naval ships require constant resupply. And we're simply not in a position to do that right now, and would have to rely on foreign contractors, and that's a iffy proposition, especially in a war. But yes, in answer to your question about the Reagan, the money that the Reagan budget devoted to the military, in specific the Navy, absolutely. The Chinese Navy is now larger than ours. It may not be more capable, but it's larger, and its capabilities are increasing. And any conflict with China is going to be a fundamentally naval conflict. It's been a long-standing policy of the United States, going back to the founding, of protecting freedom of navigation on the high seas. That's under question in the Taiwan Strait. It's under question in the Middle East with the Houthis and the access to the Suez Canal. It's under question in the Black Sea and the Ukrainians' ability to import and export. So this tenet of freedom of global navigation, that has been a column, a pillar of American foreign and military policy since the history of the Republic, since the beginning of the Republic, is now a question.
Seth, I want to close with a final question, and it's this. We talked about the debate coming up in a month. If you were moderating that debate and you could ask a single question of both Trump and Biden, what would that question be?
Well, it would be it doesn't have to be the same question.
Oh, sure. No, this is your show. This is your show here. So if you got two, you can throw two.
I would ask Mr. Trump what he plans to do about Ukraine, the Middle East, and Taiwan, the Taiwan Strait. And to what extent a military buildup similar to the Reagan one is part of his thinking, and why. I guess I'd ask, I mean, the problem with asking politicians these questions is that they're very easy to avoid
Right.
the answer.
Right.
But if I could get a fairly straight answer, I'd ask Mr. Biden what he's trying to do.
Yeah. In the world today. Okay. Well, Seth, that's a great way to end it. Really appreciate you taking the time to be with us today. Seth Cropsey, everybody, regular commentator in the Wall Street Journal. Really encourage everybody to read those when they're available. He's got one out this week on Iran. You should take a look at it if you haven't already. In the meantime, Seth, I want to thank you again for joining us.
Brian, it's a pleasure. Nice talk. Good talking with you, and good luck to you.
And as we go into the weekend, I want to wish everybody a happy and safe Memorial Day weekend, and we'll see you all next week. Thanks, Seth.
Change with no